Okay, government students, we're going to talk about the Constitutional Convention of 1787. You have read the Constitution, you've read the Articles of Confederation, you know what the differences are. You understand that the Articles of Confederation gave a national government that was just too weak, and that caused a lot of problems. And so we have the Constitution to replace it. But the process of making that Constitution is a fascinating piece of American history and an important one. So, if you ever get the chance to go to Philadelphia, you can actually go to Independence Hall and go into the room where the Constitutional Convention met and see the tables and chairs, many of which are the actual chairs that were there at that time, including the president's chair that George Washington sat in as president of the Constitutional Convention. And that's a photograph of it there that we're looking at. And you can see that there is a sun carved into the back of the chair. And Ben Franklin is famously quoted as saying that as the convention was going on, he often looked at that sun and wondered whether it was a rising sun or a setting sun. And by the end of the convention, he was convinced that indeed the sun was rising on the United States instead of setting on the United States. So that gives you a little feel for the place. If you're really interested, one of these two books, or both of them, I suppose, you could read, and they give you a very detailed description of the convention and the debates and arguments that people had that ended up with our Constitution. Okay, so what are we going to do today? Our objective is for you to know enough about the Constitutional Convention to be able to choose one of the states that's represented in the convention and write a paragraph on where that state stood on three key questions. One, how would states be represented with the new Constitution? Two, would there be more state sovereignty or national sovereignty? And remember that the entire reason that this convention is happening is because the Articles of Confederation has a weak national government. And then C, the continued existence of the slave trade and of slavery itself, which was a very thorny issue at the time, and we still have the remnants of that as thorny issues in our country today. So the first plan to be thrown out there at the convention was the Virginia Plan, written by James Madison, who actually showed up at the convention having already essentially written his plan for the Constitution. And it called for a bicameral legislature, bi meaning two and camera meaning a group of legislators. And so that would mean like what we have now, a House and a Senate. And in the Virginia plan, both the House and the Senate would have their seats apportioned by the population. So if your state had more people in it, you'd get more representatives and more senators. The legislature would then choose the president, the executive branch, and choose the judges. And that was the Virginia plan. Well, as you can imagine, that wasn't very exciting to folks from states with smaller populations, for example, New Jersey. And remember that in the Articles of Confederation that they're working to replace, each state gets one vote, regardless of how much population each state has. And so the small states wanted to protect that. And New Jersey plan would do that. They said, we're just going to have one legislature, unicameral, and in that, each state will get one vote. And then instead of an individual president, there'd be an executive council that would run the executive branch. That would be chosen by the legislature. And the judges, the judiciary, would be chosen by that executive council. and they would have lifetime tenure. So that was the New Jersey plan to combat or argue against the Virginia plan. Now, in both of these, the national power was much more powerful than state government power. And so, who would have been particularly worried by this? Well, it wasn't the people who were at this convention, because the people who were at this convention, and they became known as Federalists, were all in favor of having a more potent national government. It was the anti-Federalists who were against this. Well, as you know, neither one of those plans is in our current Constitution or in the Constitution as it was finalized in 1787. The Connecticut Compromise split the difference. So we have a House of Representatives based on our population and a Senate in which each state gets 2 senators regardless of what population size they are. They also ended up with deciding who the president, the executive, would be based on an electoral college. And the electoral college is the total number of members in the House plus the 2 in the Senate, tells you how many electoral votes your state gets. And so this gave an advantage to the small states, but it wasn't such an overwhelming advantage that the large states were not willing to deal with this compromise. But it does rankle some people today in large states. For example, the borough of Staten Island, which is the smallest borough in the city of New York, has almost as many people as the entire state of Wyoming. And yet Wyoming, because it has 2 senators plus 1 member of the House of Representatives, gets 3 electoral votes. Meanwhile, Staten Island has 1 congressman, and they do have their 2 senators, but they have to share them with everybody else in New York. And so they are not as well representative in the presidential election as someone from Wyoming. All right, moving on. We come to the question of slavery and realize that up in New York, the Northwest Ordinance is being passed by the Congress of the United States at the same time as this convention is going on. And so they would have been well aware of that. And it prohibited slavery in the Northwest Territory. And it said that 3 to 5 new states could be admitted from that territory. So that gave the states that had large numbers of slaves and whose economy was entirely dependent on slaves, the representatives from those states, obviously the slaves wouldn't have thought that way, but the representatives from those states at this convention were a little bit concerned, because if you bring in these new states, then perhaps they would eventually want to abolish slavery. At the same time, there was really good soil in those places. And if you were a South Carolina planter or a Virginia planter, and your crop was tobacco, and tobacco could not be grown profitably unless you had slave labor, then you might not want to have to compete with better soil that had slave labor available to it. And that's how the southern states decided that it was okay that the Northwest Ordinance should pass and slavery be prohibited there. And then the slave trade, not slavery itself, but bringing slaves from Africa to other countries, was international sentiment against that was growing in 1787, and particularly over in Westminster, where Parliament is for the United Kingdom, William Wilberforce was speaking strongly against that. He founded the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade in 1787. So realized that slavery was still legal in all states except Massachusetts in this time period, even though there weren't large numbers of slaves in many of the northern states. Pennsylvania had by this time passed a law for gradual abolition of slavery, but slavery was still legal there. And importation of slaves from foreign countries was illegal already in all states except Georgia and South Carolina. Now, why would it be that Georgia and South Carolina would continue to allow slaves to be imported from across the Atlantic, which everybody knew was a barbaric situation in which many of the slaves, the captured people, didn't even survive the crossing? Well, in Georgia and South Carolina, they had both been occupied by the British during the Revolutionary War, and a large number of slaves had escaped to the British lines and left when the British left. So their population of slaves was depleted, as well as the fact that their climates were not as conducive to long-term survival as some of the more northern states like Virginia and Maryland. And so economically, although they acknowledged, or at least most of them at that time acknowledged, that this was an evil, it was an evil they were not willing to give up because their economy depended on it. So the compromise that you find in the Constitution was that Congress would be allowed to ban slave imports after 1808, 20 years down the road. And in fact, when Thomas Jefferson was president, Congress did ban that. In 1807, they passed the law saying that as of January 1st, 1808, no longer can anyone import slaves into the United States. And then they had the problem of how do we count the slaves as far as representation in the House of Representatives and by extension, the Electoral College. Naturally, states that had a large number of slaves felt like they should be counted because those slaves, even though they didn't give them the right to vote, had to eat and had to have some degree of clothing, etc. And so they argued that if the government doesn't represent them, then they will not have any ability to take care of their slaves. Meanwhile, states where there weren't very many slaves said that is completely hypocritical. If you're not going to allow these folks a right to vote, then you shouldn't be allowed to count them in figuring out the House of Representatives and the Electoral College. And the compromise that they came up with was that they would count 3/5 of them as a person. So if you had 5 enslaved people, then 3 of them would count as far as the census, figuring out how many were going to go into the House of Representatives and how many were going to be, therefore, members of the Electoral College. And finally, the last compromise they made was a fugitive slave clause, which said that if you have someone who is a slave that escapes to a non-slave state, they have to be returned. Now, nowhere in the Constitution did the word slavery appear. And that tells you that it tells me, you may not agree with this, but it tells me that the founders, the people who wrote the Constitution, felt that slavery was evil. They just weren't willing to give it up. They didn't want to use the word in their document, but they weren't willing to give it up. So, here's your assignment. Assume that you are a delegate from a state other than Virginia or New Jersey, because I've already told you where those two states stand on these questions, and write a paragraph with at least 5 sentences that explains where your state stands on the debate between the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan, and secondly, where your state stands on banning the slave trade and abolishing slavery. So that's your assignment. You're going to write a paragraph. You're going to put yourself in the position of being a delegate from a state other than Virginia or New Jersey. You can pick New York, you can pick North Carolina, South Carolina, Delaware, whichever one you want other than Virginia and New Jersey, and write this paragraph. All right. Good luck with that, and thanks for listening.